I'm Jill Daly, president of the Friends of Huddard and Wunderlich Parks. I'm here today with Susan Lang. She and I co-chaired the Folger Stable project now 10 years ago. So this is our 10th anniversary of providing museum visitors and field trippers with a unique experience here in this beautiful 100-year-old stable and located in Wunderlich Park in Woodside, California. So we're going to start by offering you a glimpse into the past, looking at the family history of the inhabitants of the Folger stable and the property before the Folgers actually bought it. You would have seen some of this history already in the Silent Witness video.
Just to start, we are standing in the carriage room of the Folger stable that was built in 1905. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the Folger family and then talk about a little bit about the other displays that are in our museum. When you come into the museum, you'll see that we've donated about 3 walls to the families that were associated with the development of the property and of the stable. Starting with the most important family, which is the Folger family. The Folger family originated back in England, came to Nantucket, and then eventually, when the gold rush happened, 3 of the sons of Samuel Folger, who was the main man of the family, sent 3 of his sons to the gold rush. And they were hoping to make their fortune there. The youngest son, Jim Folger, James, was deemed not old enough to go to the gold country. So he stayed back in San Francisco while the other 2 sons went to the gold country. In San Francisco, he worked for a coffee and spice mill, and he worked for there until 1852, when he was thought old enough to go to the gold country. So he went there, and he was hoping to strike it rich, of course, but he was also given some packets from the coffee company that he worked for, and said, "This is coffee ready for the pot," as they described it. And he went to the gold country, and he apparently did very well selling his coffee ready for the pot. So he stayed there. He tried to make a strike, the gold strike, but he apparently probably made more money selling coffee than he did with selling the gold. So he came back, but he was quite successful when he returned to San Francisco. So eventually he actually bought the coffee and spice company and renamed it Folger's Coffee. His son was James Folger II, and he came, and in 1902 he bought the property that we're on today, and he wanted to build on it a stable because he wanted his family to be able to come from San Francisco during the foggy days in the summer to stay down here. The family ultimately sold Folger's Coffee in 1963. You can see the way Folger's is written is different here. This can was done prior to the sale of Folger's Coffee to Procter & Gamble in '63. Once it was sold to Procter & Gamble, they took out the apostrophe because it was no longer belonging to the Folger family, so it just became Folger's with an S. In 1956, Mr. Wunderlich, Martin Wunderlich, purchased almost 1,000 acres from the Folger family, and his intent was to actually develop it and have a golf course on top and a big subdivision. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but then finally in 1974, I think realizing that he actually just wasn't going to get the permits, he couldn't build his subdivision, he then donated it was 940 acres to the county of San Mateo, and that became Wunderlich Park in honor of Martin Wunderlich. Prior to Folger, Simon Jones owned all of this property, and Simon Jones came in 1872, and he was the last owner of the property to use it for agricultural purposes. He had fruit trees, and he raised mostly grapes. And we have a little display here about the grapes that he raised. He raised them not for wine, but for raisins. He exported to China. because he had a partner in Hong Kong. Another thing that Simon Jones did was to import laborers, build an incredible series of walls around the property. They're dry stack walls, meaning they didn't have any mortar, which was quite amazing, especially since they've lasted for well over 150 years. So that was another thing that Simon Jones did. And the last thing he did that was of interest and importance was when in 1882, the Exclusion Act was passed. And this meant that Chinese people could not own property. They were given a very hard time here. And Simon Jones thought they were very good laborers and supported their work.
Now this is a direct representation of what the stalls look like in the Folger stable when they were built. This is a very different way of keeping horses than it was at the turn of the century. These are called tie stalls, and you can see these beautiful brass finials are actually the original finials that were on top of each tie stall in the stable. The transition between the horse and carriage and the horseless carriage. So if you think about the Model Ts came out in 1905. So this is an area where we describe that transition. You can see that a horseless carriage looks very much like a carriage. If you can see this carriage here, if you can imagine putting wheels on this doctor's buggy, it would look very much like a Model T or a Model A. And so one thing that is very hypnotizing but very wonderful here is this video that we have, a visual journey from one end of Barker Street to the other the week before the 1906 earthquake. And you can really see the combination of horse and carriage and horseless carriage here, all operating in a very sort of chaotic way, but you know, it appears to work. They all going in the right direction, both coming and going, and it's a fascinating look at that transitional period. Kind of designed this area to represent what would have happened, what would have happened here on the Folger property. And the blacksmith and the farrier would have been very important workers here to keep things moving. Think about the amount of forgery that probably happened on the property to create many of these beautiful architectural details. For instance, you can see this is one of the original iron grates that actually are on all of these beautiful big plate glass windows. So the blacksmith would have been providing these kinds of services. The farrier would have been taking care of the horses' shoes. And this is actually a pretty accurate display of what their workshops would have looked like. Here, that really takes you through the evolution of the horse in its sort of biological evolution, as well as its role in history, and in its role in the development of this area, for instance. Other display that we want to bring your attention to is the perilous lives of the early loggers. This is an interesting look at what the men who did the early logging's lives were like. And there are many museums that talk about the equipment and the methods with which these loggers took down these large redwoods, but we wanted to focus really on what the actual day-to-day life was like for these men who were so rugged and who were now trying to figure out how to get these giant trees out. Historically, it was one man per tree, but when these settlers came here and found these giant trees, which were a source of much of the wood to build San Francisco during and after the gold rush, it became necessary that there were 2 men per tree at least. Remiss of us not to mention that there are some lovely carriages here. I'd like to point out are the governess cart, for one. And it's very cute when we ask the kids when they come for a field trip, by the way, what is a governess? And a lot of the kids raise their hands and say, well, it's a female governor. So for all of us who grew up with Mary Poppins and The Sound of Music, we know that a governess was the nanny and the teacher. And this is a cart that would have been pulled by ponies, probably. It's very small here. The children would have sat sat on these beautiful velvet cushions with the entrance on the back. The next one is the doctor's buggy, and this was donated to us by Rosekrantz. He had it restored for us, and you can see that it's a very small, light buggy, but with very big wheels. So this was a buggy that can go fast. Obviously, the emergency vehicle of its day. And then the other carriage that I think is absolutely spectacular. This would have been probably driven by a woman. She would have, there's a nice little pillow which would have elevated her so she could have seen the horse ahead of her. It would have been driven by a woman with one horse. And then in the back, you can see that there's a cushion here for the groom to sit. So he would have tended the horse while the lady who drove the carriage would have gone in to shop or visit her friends. It's so beautifully appointed again with the wicker, and it's a beautiful color, and we're so lucky to have it. It's quite unique.
A look back at our struggle for freedom, trace our present day's strength to its source, and you'll find that man's pathway to glory is strewn with the bones of a horse. I love that quote.
So the Friends of Huddard and Wunderlich is very proud of this accomplishment 10 years ago, to be able to take the stable and rescue it from the possibility of demolition by neglect, and to create a place in the community where people can learn about history and enjoy an enhancement to their park visit. One of the things that the Friends does is provide 3rd and 4th grade field trips with our partners, the San Mateo County Historical Association. And those field trips have served thousands of kids. They come up on Wednesdays and Fridays during the school year, and they learn about the history of the park, the early inhabitants, and what kinds of activities would have taken place on a property like this at the turn of the century. So we're very proud of that. We have the museum open on Saturdays, and hopefully going to continue with that post-pandemic. We're delighted to share this beautiful exhibit space with the public, and the Friends also provides hiking experiences and natural programming for children in both Wunderlich and Huddard parks. So we'd like to invite you to come up and enjoy the park, enjoy the museum.